Behind the Bulb is a deep dive into the ideas and industries of our world. Have you ever looked at a structure and asked, whatever happened to the people that built this? What motivated those people to wake up in the morning and head off to work? No matter the occupation, these are real questions. Put simply, why do we do what we do? This season, we focus on the building industry. We know the basic principles of how things are built, but we often don't know the narratives of the people involved in building them. Lend us your ears as we unfold their journey. Whether you are a part of the building industry or not, we think you will enjoy listening to these inspiring stories. Welcome to Behind the Bulb. I'm Brendan McCartney.
And I'm James Young.
On this week's episode, our final episode in this season, we speak with a gentleman who is at the end of his career, and we look back at the journey that he has taken from when he was younger to now, and how at one point he didn't know what he wanted. Much like the other guests we've spoken to, people are at different parts within their careers. Some are in a place they want to be and know they'll be for a long time. Others might look for another opportunity just down the line. In speaking with Dan Blitzer, it's very clear after we cover the 60s, 70s, and 80s, he has worked a career that he is happy with. How does one do that? How do small decisions make a major impact on your career? How is it that sometimes you don't know necessarily what you want, but somebody else might, like your mom, who says, you should be a teacher, you should be an educator? Dan covers all of these topics, including his mother's favorite recipe. He's a joy to listen to and has a lot to share, and there's a lot to learn. We're humbled and delighted today to have a wonderful guest, Daniel Blitzer, a patient educator, has excellent elocution, and has spent a lifetime around the manufacturing business. And personally, a mentor of mine. What we really want to know, Dan, is what was your favorite dinner as a child?
Oh, my mother made a fabulous veal stew to which she added sweet Italian sausage. And that was easily a good 55 years ago, and I remember it still. Thanks for a surprise question from left field, guys.
Yeah. Try to break the ice a little bit.
No, it was a great icebreaker.
Yeah. So, where did you grow up, Dan?
I was born in Greenwich Village, and when I was 2 years old, my parents moved from Horatio Street, which is in the West Village, to 12th Street, which is in the middle of Greenwich Village. And my mother lived in that apartment until she died some 65 years later. So I'm a New York City born and bred child.
Was that a common thing she made for dinner?
No, that was relatively special. The more common feeding the children were things like cube steaks. I don't know if you guys know what those are.
No.
You ever seen a cube steak?
I don't know what that is.
So imagine a cut of beef that's really not good for much, and the processor whacks it so that it looks like it has cross-hatched cubes on it, and you can then pan fry it and feed it to your children.
That's what dinner was growing up, for the most part?
Well, that was some of it. And then there was pasta and grilled cheese sandwiches. And when my parents entertained guests from Europe, which they did on occasion, they would serve them what was perceived to be American food, which was a good steak, not the cube steak, and baked potatoes and so forth. But we kids didn't get to enjoy that until we were older.
So what do you find yourself doing for work today?
So today, so far this year, I've been writing and recording training videos, which are essentially animated PowerPoints rather than live action video. One is for the IES, which is a 8-part series for entry level, and the other is a 4-part series for a manufacturer of decorative lighting in New York. And I also do consulting work for the Pacific Northwest National Laboratories, who is a contractor to the Department of Energy. And that is some writing. I've written a couple of articles and a couple of presentations. That's a little bit more collaborative because there's a really smart and hardworking team that's associated with that group, whereas the first two that I mentioned are somewhat more solo activities.
And so it's our understanding, Dan, that you come from a manufacturing family. Growing up, do you have a particular first memory of your family business?
So it was my great-grandfather who founded the Lightlear Company with partners around 1904. And then leadership passed to my grandfather. And when I was growing up, the company was headquartered and its primary manufacturing facilities were in a not-so-nice part of Jersey City, New Jersey. And my father regularly worked Saturdays. And occasionally, the kids would get to go in. So my earliest memories of that situation was riding the freight elevator up the different floors of the factory. The designers were on the second floor, the sales and administration was on the 8th floor, and there was various forms of manufacturing of largely decorative lighting in between. And so there was the noise of a freight elevator and the smells of metal fabrication and finishing that permeated the facility. And I remember that very clearly.
Was there a floor you liked to get off more than the others, such as the design floor, the sales floor? Was there one like, this is the place I want to be?
Oh, it was the design floor. Because the design floor had the most interesting people, naturally, and it had samples and people who smoked pipes and had interesting drawings on the walls. And so that was the more interesting part of it. That was also my father's bailiwick, although he had his working space on the 8th floor, but he really was more at home in the design side himself.
So those sound like they were fond memories, at least spending time at the facility.
So Lightlear was a family-dominated firm from its outset. I say dominated rather than owned because ownership was also spread around to a fair number of employees in sales and marketing and the manufacturing leadership. When my grandfather died in 1969, the company went public. He had insisted that it not do so while he was still alive and essentially the titular head of the company. But when he passed on, it was the consensus that the company needed additional capital to grow, so it went public in 1969. And what was surprising at the time is that the stock, which was largely purchased by people who were familiar with the company, it was issued on the American Stock Exchange at the time, people were astonished at how small the company was in terms of its annual sales turnover, because it had a very high-profile reputation and brand, and people just associated high profile with high volume, but of course it really wasn't at the time. So it was from 1969 on a publicly traded company with family in a dominant but not majority shareholder position, which ultimately proved unfortunate because when the company needed additional capital, this is now in the early 1980s, it expanded, it got caught a little bit short, and so its loan covenants came due, and it had to raise capital. So it made a secondary stock offering, and that put the company in play. A number of companies looked like they were going to make hostile takeover offerings, and so executives called around to all the people they knew who were also stockholders and said, please don't sell your shares. We think we can make the company worth more by our own management. You grew up with this company, or your husbands or wives grew up with this company. Stick with us. But as it turned out, the hostile takeover started to accumulate shares, and it was pretty clear that they were going to be successful. And one of the executives called around to find out why people had sold, and they said, "Oh, well, we didn't sell to them; we sold to somebody else." Well, of course, once you sell your shares, they're naturally going to find their way into the hands of the people who want them more. So the company rather quickly arranged to be acquired by a conglomerate called Barenco, and ultimately became Genlite, which was ultimately acquired by Philips. So I actually never worked for it when it was a family-owned company, but of course, family was occupied the important executive positions when I was there.
Right. So in 1969, where were you at that time?
I was a junior in high school in 1969. In 1974, I graduated college, but in 1973, I don't know if you guys remember this, well, or at least only from reading, there was a sharp recession, and Lightyear lost money. This was the beginning of energy consciousness, and of course there was the gasoline embargo and energy prices soared. And with my economics background, I said, well, since electricity is an important contributor to the cost of lighting, and when cost goes up, obviously utilization goes down, so this is really bad. High energy prices are bad for lighting, so I decided I didn't want to get into the business. I don't think I've ever made a worse judgment than that. I've made some bad ones, but that was clearly the worst one I ever made. Not so much that I didn't go into lighting, that I didn't understand that, of course, high energy prices have been very good for lighting as a spur to technological development and to retrofit sales. But that all came later. So in 1974, I decided I wanted to do something different. I wanted to go into real estate. I had studied city planning along with economics, and I couldn't get a job in real estate because I didn't have any real estate experience. So I said, "Oh, you guys, I'm going to be smarter than you. I'm going to get in a side door." So I went and looked for jobs at important real estate investors. And one in particular was an insurance company, which in those days were major real estate holders. But they wouldn't take me either for anything in real estate. They said, "No, you don't have any experience." I said, "But if you gave me a job, I'd have experience." They said, "No, it doesn't work that way." But I did take a job in marketing. And so I spent the first 5 years of my career doing marketing for a financial institution. And at one point, it was a 10,000 employee company, and I just wasn't fitting in. I didn't have the right appearance. I was wearing a beard. I didn't have the right background. It just wasn't going to work for me. And I wasn't really all that excited about any form of market differentiation among all the investment companies. So I said to my wife, which was the only really good thing that came out of my time in the financial company, "I'm looking for a smaller company." And she said, "Well, you know one. Why don't you think about Lightyear?" I hadn't really thought about lighting, but I was eager. So I called up the head of human resources, for whom I had worked one summer doing compensation calculations as the company moved from a 100% commission compensation structure to a salary plus bonus based on quotas. And I did the calculation work to figure out how this was going to play out in different markets. So I called up Walter and I said, "Walter, hi, it's Dan Blitzer. I'd like to talk to you about opportunities to Lightyear." And he said, "Oh." And if I had been holding the phone in my hand, which of course I was, it would have felt like dry ice. It was so cold all of a sudden. And this was not at all the reception I'd expected. "What do you want to do?" He said, "I'd like to become a salesman." "Fantastic. Why don't you come in? I have to talk to you right away." So I don't know what he thought I wanted. Maybe he thought I wanted an express elevator to the executive suite, but that's not what I wanted at all. I wanted to go out and be a salesman and learn the business on the ground. So I get in there, we talk a little bit. He says, "Where would you like to work?" And of course, I knew where to work because I knew who the best regional managers were because I'd done all the comp studies. "I'd like to go to Seattle." He said, "Well, we don't have any room in Seattle." So evidently my parentage didn't carry a lot of weight here. "Would you mind going to San Francisco?" And I said, "Sure." I wrapped up my work on the 31st of October, and on the 1st of November, I was on a plane to California.
Did you have a family at the time?
And I didn't actually have a wife at the time. So the woman who made the suggestion was my girlfriend at the time, and subsequently we married.
Okay.
So it was easy to get out to the West Coast, and the idea of going to a different part of the country was very appealing. So I got out there. I didn't realize it at the time, but San Francisco sales territory for Lightlear was like scorched earth. In the previous 4 or 5 years, the sales management had essentially manipulated the marketplace. Packaging, which you guys know about today, was relatively new in the 1970s. And Al Ehrlich, who was the RVP at the time and ran the San Francisco market, was able to put together a package when most agencies didn't have one. And with that, he was able to negotiate deals with contractors that were better than competition could put together. But he always had to ultimately have a lower lot price, otherwise why would they deal with it? Sometimes the factory wouldn't give him that pricing. And so he would make it up himself. And he would tell the contractor, "Look, I know we agreed at $250,000, but the best I can do from the factory is $300,000. So you're going to submit $50,000 in back charges, and I'm going to approve them." And I made up the numbers. Well, eventually he got caught doing this. And while he was in the saddle, he naturally made lots and lots of enemies. Not only every other rep agency at the time, but also all the contractors who weren't making deals with him. So he was ultimately caught and removed. And at the same time, the company ran into difficulty in production and meeting its order requirements. So jobs were late and late and late. And as a result, the company's place, which had been dominant in the San Francisco market, was decimated. And I didn't really know that when I arrived.
When you arrived in, do you find your passion is for studying markets? What do you consider, or maybe even at that time, you had a passion that you much would rather have been doing, or were you pursuing that in moving into that position? It gave you an opportunity to analyze the market you were operating in.
Well, let's see. If you don't know how to swim and you suddenly get dropped into a pool of water, your passion might be for the butterfly, or it might be for the Australian crawl, but mostly it's to keep your head above water. I was brand new, and I had a name that made me particularly vulnerable to failure. So it was very, very important for me to succeed, and that's really what I was focused on. Fortunately, I found a number of customers with whom I connected, some my own age, some older, and they were all very supportive. And as a result, I learned relatively quickly. And although I didn't get a chance to stay in the California market beyond 3 years, you guys probably know the name Rosenden. You know the name Rosenden?
Yes.
One of their project managers was recommending us, which was a 180-degree turnaround from there. So I had friends who were contractors. I had friends who were distributors. But my best network were among lighting designers. So I guess to answer your question, I very quickly wound up interested in the specification side of the business. Although I was initially a full-line salesperson doing all the jobs in a territory, and then ultimately became the distribution and market manager for the section all the way on.
And the experiences that you had up until this point, right? So from the memory of going to your family's business at that time, before 1969, and coming out onto the second floor of the design room, or going up to the 8th floor, all the way up to the point where the company goes public. It's a family business, but starting to shift in direction. You then go through a realization of, well, the real estate's not working. Let me go to Lightalier. And then you get out to California and you're starting to build a successful network that's helping you succeed in your position. All of those experiences, do you find things you do today, you're still applying some of the lessons you've learned?
So I got out to California in November 1979. In February 1980, the lighting designer asked me if I would give a training session on lighting fixtures. And I guess I was not too careful about what I agreed to, but I agreed to take it. And so I am still doing that aspect of the work. I still think about the manufacturing business to some degree from the design profession's perspective. So yeah, I would say that that's all the case. And if you look through the ranks of leading lighting personalities, the one that's probably most familiar to you guys would be Jim Benya, who's high profile in California. They were all in San Francisco at one point or another. And I had a chance to meet them. And those connections, as much as everything else, were important. Then finally, I would say there's one lighting designer in particular who really took an interest in my development and education. She treated me certainly with more respect than I deserved, but she was interested in my ideas, why I don't know, and she spent time teaching me. And I guess that also left an impression on me, because I've always liked being able to work with people and give them some of the same benefits that I received from Fran way back when.
Do you find it's the relationships you've had, the things you've been taught, that helps drive you today, inspires you to wake up in the morning and motivates you to continue to educate and consult in the field of lighting?
That's an interesting question. I changed and matured in many ways from my 20s to my, 60s, as it were. But I think that fundamentally, like almost all people, you don't really change. So the desire to have an impact, to do something that would, in whatever way, big or small, make a difference, has always been a motivation. And in effect, I went from a large company to a smaller company to a company that couldn't get any smaller than it is now, which is one person. So you might say that I was never a very big fish, but I certainly found smaller and smaller pools to swim in. But mostly that was the drive. The drive was, what can you do? How can you make a difference? How can you get something done? And I think that's always been there. It's only been in the last 30 years or so that I've really been able to effectuate that in an important way.
Is there a trick? I mean, and I say this in a way, I came to know of you by way of my first position and with Philips Lighting, and at their manufacturing facility, they would take some of the employees through an education center at a world-class facility. And through this, my first foray into lighting after college, we were introduced to a couple instructors. You were one of those instructors, and your articulation of lighting was unique and thorough, but there was also a patience with the students, right, and the employees who were, for the most part, coming at this without any knowledge of lighting. And educating somebody can be tough and require a lot of patience. You clearly at that time had been doing it. This is back in 2010. So you had been doing it for quite some time, since the 80s, and had a craft developed. What are some of the tricks? And trick perhaps is not the right word, but the only one that comes to mind.
So I'll answer the question, but I'll tell you another anecdote before we do that. So I get the job with Lightalier, and I'm packing up, getting ready to finish up the work I was doing previously. And I call my mother and say, Mom, I'm going to work for Lightalier in San Francisco. And she says, No, you should be a teacher. Mom, no, I'd like to go into business. You should be a teacher. Mom, I want to go into business. I want to learn how the business works from the ground up. No, you should be a teacher. I said, Mom, I've taken the job. But the point about this story is, A, your mother's always right. But B, of course, there's something in the way I approached life that clearly made me likely to like a teaching job. So if you ask for what are the techniques, the one that's most important is you have to like the people you're working with. Like if you don't like the people in the seat, so to speak, how are you possibly going to be successful at this? That's number one. Number two, I think you have to have a connection. It's not enough just to like them, but you also have to be able to connect with people in one way or another. And everybody does that in slightly different ways. One of the groups that we had for the Phillips Lighting Application Center were a group of high school students in a entrepreneurial program. And the person who founded the program brought them back every year because somehow, even though they weren't going to go into lighting and the technology was really irrelevant to their life prospects from there, they had a good time, they were fascinated, and I somehow was able to connect with them. So, it turns out that the hardest people to teach are truly experienced people coming to it. They already know so much, and they filter everything that you want to teach them that they don't know through the perspective of what they already have learned. So they turn out to be much more difficult than people who don't know anything at all. And you can't put this on the blog, but basically, when you're teaching people who are brand new, you're like God. You know everything. They don't know anything. And as long as you don't look like you've made a mistake, you're omniscient.
Right.
So what could be bad about this?
I remember a moment you had, I think there were a couple classes were being presented at the application center there at Phillips, and one of the exercises that was performed was to go to the neighboring mall with your peers along with the instructors, grouped off, and each group was assigned different stores, or they had to walk around the mall and walk into different stores, whether it was a shoe manufacturer, or if it was a high-end design, or if it was a jewelry retailer, and observe the lighting and make different comments about it and some of the qualities and the aspects of it. Collect this information within an hour or 2 hours, and then everybody would proceed over to a dinner, and each group would present on their findings from different stores within the mall, which ones were more attractive, which ones perhaps failed in their execution of lighting. That whole concept, where did that come from?
Well, field trips for formal training probably go back, in my experience, to my training with Lightalier in the early 1980s. In those days, it was a 2-week arrangement. And we came in and we probably did some field work there, and I did field work when teaching at Untitled. But and many other people do things like that. I think the trick is, what is it that you want people who are brand new to lighting get out of that? And it was mostly not the soundness of their observations, no offense meant there, of course, but it was just getting comfortable using the language, and importantly, learning how to see and speak about lighting, not just about lighting equipment. So, Philips, it would be very easy to talk all about the light bulbs or later about the light bulbs and light fixtures, but the idea was to help people see and feel comfortable talking about ambient lighting and focal lighting and contrast and all of the terms that go into creating a comfort with lighting itself. It was also the case that we were taking people out of a class that they would otherwise have been sitting in seats for 4 days without a break. And it's one thing to have high school students do that. By the time you have adults want to go out and do things. They want to try on the knowledge firsthand. They want to practice because they're already doers in one way or another.
In the education of lighting, how do you bring construction into your education, and how the luminaire plays into the high rise, and how it works within the electrical contractor's scope? And as you're teaching the science of lighting, do you bring in the concept of construction? How do you educate that part of it too?
It's quite challenging to describe something to somebody who's never seen it. So I think you have limited ability. If you have supporting materials, you can show illustrations. If you have exercises, you can give people a chance to do that. One of the other benefits, of course, walking around a mall is it is a real space. And of course, there were real spaces at the Philips Application Center. But absent those tools, what I typically do is tell stories, which is what really great teachers do all the time. I don't include myself in that group, but you pick up anecdotes and stories of different types. An architect wanted a specific light fixture. This goes back a time, and it was a 9-inch deep round light fixture, 4 feet in diameter. You have to imagine that. That's a huge thing. But when it came to the job, they didn't have 9 inches clear plenum space. He said, "What should I do?" I said, "You should lower the ceiling." He did in that case. It was, but that gives everybody some sense of what's going on. When I learned about customer service from one of the senior salespeople at Untitled when I got out to California. I arrived in early November and spent 3 days traveling with different salespeople. Well, Pat Kelly was the senior salesperson in Orange County. I guess that's just a little north of where you guys are. And Pat was absolutely overjoyed to have some wet behind the ears guy tagging along with him getting in his way. But he put up with me. And he said, I've got a QC call. I've got to go out into the country. So we went out there, and it was a branch bank. And the contractor was having difficulty getting the light fixture into the ceiling. So Pat says, let me see the drawings. Let me see the specification. Let me see the order. So he takes a look at all the pieces of paper. He turns to the electrical contractor. Remember, Pat's the leading salesman in the territory, and he says, and I quote, "You dumb shit. You ordered the wrong thing." And these were in the days when there were all different ways that you could build a grid light fixture. And in effect, if you happened to have ordered the wrong one and it didn't fit the ceiling you were using, you'd have to do something different. And the interesting thing about this is the contractor didn't slug Pat, didn't argue with Pat. He simply look to see if he couldn't pin it on the distributor. I didn't find out what ultimately happened. What I learned was that if you're the dominant salesperson in the territory, you can get away with that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're Dan Blitzer just beginning, don't you try that all the way through. I don't think there's any substitute for walking through projects under construction.
Right.
Because plans, two-dimensional drawings, even those that have the sophistication of today's computer-aided design, don't communicate what's really going on in three dimensions in the construction world. Much later, I guess it was around 1999, 1998, I was then a consultant, and I got called to do field service for a division of Lightolier that operated out of Fontana, California. And they had just launched a line of ultra narrow T5 fluorescent luminaires, pendants. And I discovered that because the wiring compartments were so small, and perhaps that the company was a little sloppy in its manufacturing, there were a lot of wiring issues. So I got to go onto job sites. And even though New York City, which is where I was at the time, is a strong union environment, because I was fixing things, I was permitted to handle the light fixtures. As soon as it came time to actually connect the wires, the individual electricians took over, and I had the chance to watch them ply their trade, and I became very impressed with the skill of the individual installers in terms of handling wiring and making the lighting fixtures safe to operate, which of course is what they're trained to do. But from a manufacturer's perspective, you never really get that impression. Contractors are the ones who drop the light fixtures and all the other kinds of things that they get blamed for. You never really see what they are able to do and how important it is to have qualified people on the job keeping the electrical system safe.
Dan, where are you living today?
Where I'm residing at the moment in the southwestern corner of Massachusetts, about 125 miles north of New York City. In March, the family left the city for a less dense environment for obvious reasons. And we've been here ever since.
I have a question. Did you get criticized a lot for facial hair? I watched a video that you were in, and you made a comment about your beard as well. I'm just curious. Me and Brendan are both beard guys. I'm wondering, like in the 70s and 80s, was that frowned upon?
So this beard, seriously, dates from 1968. There are a few photographs of me without it, but I've essentially had it all that time. And yes, working in the insurance company and wanting to go out in the field and learn the business as a salesperson, which is what I wanted to do there, they were going to let me near a customer. They were happy to have me write copy for marketing materials, to analyze market information, do all kinds of things. But no, couldn't get next to a customer. But I wasn't really. It was more than the beard, of course. It was a whole. The whole image that was out of sync with the company. When I got out into the field in California, I don't think it made a difference. It was, construction and design are much more relaxed.
In the beginning of our conversation, you mentioned your great-grandfather and your grandfather, and you've just welcomed your first grandson into the world.
He is the most fabulous grandson that ever existed, in my completely unbiased opinion. It is the silver lining to this terrible cloud we're all under, that Noah, that's my eldest son, and his family, including Dylan, the grandson, have been able to move up and are now living nearby. So I get to see and babysit Dylan 5 days a week.
Fantastic.
So I didn't say that when you asked what I was doing, but I take a couple of hours out of each day when, and if I can't, then Joyce covers for me to play with Dylan. He isn't walking yet. He's babbling, and there isn't any chance he's going to go into lighting. There's much more of a chance that he'll go into finance, which is where his father is.
Well, perhaps he'll be financing construction projects.
Could be. That's Noah's company does a lot with transportation.
So, Dan, do you feel like this is are you near retirement? Is this the end of your chapter in lighting, or your book of lighting?
I hope not, but I am a little anxious that when the current contracts run out, it will be difficult to find new ones. It's difficult to market because everybody's remote, and budgets are going to be tight because companies' revenues have fallen. So my personal ambition was to have another 5 years active, and if I can hold the business together for another 18 months, there's a chance that things will pick up and I'll be able to find a gig. It was very disappointing when Signify, Philips, essentially closed down the lighting application center, given how good a facility it was and how many people really appreciated it. But there's always a possibility that when things return to a better state of the world, they'll consider whether they want to revive it. People will, by that time, have been totally sick of remote learning because they already are.
Dan, we really appreciate your time. I know you got a lot going on, and you got a special grandson to spend time with, and so we appreciate you taking some time to talk about lighting and life.
Well, thank you for including me in your program. I appreciate it, and stay in touch. I'd like to hear what's going on.
We'll definitely be reaching out to you, Dan. Appreciate it.
All right. Thanks. Take care, guys.
Take care.
And that's it for this week's episode. Thank you for your time. Thanks for listening. And if you could, please subscribe and share with your family and friends.
This podcast has been sponsored by ProCal Lighting.